Refugees and, more obviously, migrants have skills, talents, and aspirations. They have capacities as well as vulnerabilities. They can confer benefits on the societies that they're part of and shouldn't be seen as a burden. They have agency and shouldn't be seen as passive victims. In other words, they can make contributions to our own societies and the societies they come from, even while abroad. But to maximize that potential, we collectively face a coordination problem. There is, in a sense, a collective action failure where the people with those skills are not always able to access the opportunities. And on the other hand, those that may wish to employ or provide opportunity to refugees and migrants may not always have the information or knowledge about how to access those migrants. So in a sense, the idea of skills matching is a way of matching demand with supply, a way of ensuring that refugees and migrants can get access to the market opportunities that might be available but they are unaware of. On this panel, we have 4 speakers who are all, in different ways, engaged in pioneering work on different aspects of matching. And I think there are 2 broad areas of matching they're involved with. The first is matching refugees and migrants with market-based opportunities, notably with employers. But the second equally interesting and pioneering area is matching refugees and migrants with states, with governments, based on market-based ideas drawn from the private sector. So to briefly introduce the 4 panelists, to my right, about 3 seats away, we have Bruce Cohen, who in 2014 co-founded with his wife, Mary Louise Cohen, who's on the front row over here, Talent Beyond Boundaries, a skills matching initiative designed to match employers with refugee talent. They're already working with Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. To my immediate right is Justina Adlita, who works for Deloitte and heads their humanitarian work. Deloitte is beginning a very exciting initiative, which I think today they'll say something publicly about for almost the first time, called Connect for Purpose, a platform designed to connect refugees to market-based opportunities, including employment. We also have Will Jones, to Justina's right, who, together with Alex Teitelboim, who is next to him, have founded something called Refugees Say, which went online and launched this week. And it's using algorithms to change the world one refugee match at a time, doing the maths in a much sexier way than that sounds, in order to ensure that refugees get access, not in this case to business opportunities and employment, but to governments that will welcome them. So taking seriously the preferences of both governments and refugees in how we think about refugee resettlement. We're also joined, and we're very privileged to be joined at late notice, by Laura Thompson, who's over to the right, to the left of Alex Alenikov, who's Deputy Director General of the International Organization for Migration, now a United Nations organization as of yesterday, who can share with us insights into the challenges and opportunities that IOM has engaged with for a long time in how to ensure that migrants have access to the best available employment opportunities. What I hope to do is ensure that all of them have a chance to showcase what they're doing, but that we can also move beyond that to think about how we work collectively to overcome the barriers to skills matching and improve the lives of refugees and migrants. So I'd like to begin with the market-based side of how we match refugees to employment opportunities. And Bruce, perhaps I could start with you, because in a way, Talent Beyond Boundaries is one of the really archetypal and, I think, pioneering initiatives in this space. You started in 2014, notably before the refugee crisis, and you've begun to build your talent catalogue. Could you tell us a bit about what you've done, the impetus behind the initiative, and the progress you've made so far?
Thank you, Professor Betts. It was before the refugee crisis had reached European shores, but the refugee crisis was already underway. When Mary Louise came up with the idea for Talent Beyond Boundaries, it seemed obvious to us that somebody should be matching skilled and talented refugees with opportunities, projects, places in the world where there are skill gaps. How horrible it must be, we thought, to be a parent, to have done everything right, to have gotten an education, to have a job, to have worked hard, to make progress, and then to have to flee conflict and be left in a dependent situation with no end in sight, with the inability to take care of your family. We went to Lebanon and confirmed for ourselves that the refugee population includes many skilled people, engineers, nurses, IT professionals, teachers, and that they were interested in global work opportunities. Since no one else was dedicated to removing the logistical barriers that had prevented them from entering the global marketplace, we decided to create Talent Beyond Boundaries and to try to help create that market for their talents in order to develop a safe and legal alternative pathway for refugees, a complement to resettlement, so that they could move through private sector employment using work visas. We believe this pathway can affect tens of thousands of refugee families. Professor Betts has often said, and I've heard him say, that refugee talents are invisible to employers. They are a hidden talent pool. So what we are doing at Talent Beyond Boundaries is a pilot project to overcome the barriers to information, to travel documents, and to skills verification in order for skilled refugees to move as talent to new opportunities and new jobs. We could not find detailed information on the skills of refugees. So we've created our own first-of-its-kind talent catalog. Working with a Syrian refugee we met in Beirut last year, we've developed an online portal where we've invited Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon to come forward and tell us about their work experience, their education, their language capacities, and they have come forward. We opened the portal just after Ramadan on July 12th. In the first 2 months, 2,200 refugees came forward and participated in the talent catalog. I think as of this morning, I checked, we're up to about 2,400. Among them are the types of people we expected: healthcare professionals, engineers, IT professionals, as well as electricians, welders, and other skilled tradespeople. About 28% report college education. About a third report some degree of English capability. So we've partnered in order to create this catalog with dozens of local and international NGOs on the ground in Lebanon and Jordan. We are consulting with and have a cooperative agreement with the UNHCR, and we are also working very closely with and supported by the U.S. State Department, who sees this as an innovation, a way to make a difference. Now we are looking to develop partnerships with businesses that will work with us on the pilot to offer employment opportunities to a handful of skilled refugees who are qualified for those jobs, so that we can find ways to systematically overcome the barriers that have prevented such matching in the past. We want to develop the tools that will allow Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon to find jobs in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world. We are not focused on the United States. We are not focused on Western Europe. Other people are doing matching in Western Europe, and we commend them. The difference is we are seeking to match people with jobs around the globe and to take them across borders for new opportunities and to involve new areas in the world in helping solve what really is a global problem. Thank you. Yeah.
One of the elements that's central to what you're doing is the idea of recognizing that refugees are not just refugees and allowing them to enter immigration channels, to access labor migration visas, rather than for their mobility to be humanitarian and through resettlement. What kind of challenges and obstacles have you faced to that idea of refugees becoming labor migrants?
What we're working on right now, and I said developing partnerships with employers. The first thing is opening up employers' eyes to their availability. This is one of those information barriers. It's almost an ideological barrier. making sure that those with work opportunities, with hard-to-fill jobs, will consider them as talent in order to fill those jobs. But we're also going to have other problems. Because we're having people move, there may be travel document problems. Not everybody's going to have an up-to-date passport. So we hope to work with UNHCR and other international authorities, with host countries, with destination countries, to make sure people can travel for work opportunities.
And what do you think you need to make this work? What are the asks you would have from others in order to make this vision effective?
Well, I could literally go around the room. We've talked to Justina before. We would love help in identifying the skill gaps in the world, which Deloitte could help us with. We are talking to the IOM, who are the masters of moving people around the world. So most of the people around this table, I suspect everybody in this room could contribute in some way or another. We are looking to partner with people. We have partnered with people. We have partnered with institutions. Right now, the key for us is finding, we have one company that's committed. If we bring them qualified people, they will hire them for IT work in North Africa. We could use one or two more businesses to provide those types of work opportunities around the world.
Justina, let's come to you and Deloitte. Deloitte is primarily a professional services firm, and for a while you've been involved in the humanitarian space as an organization. How did you get into working with refugees, and how does the project you're involved in work? What is it?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alex, for giving the platform to share about what we're doing. So this really started last year when the refugee crisis in Europe really hit the press, and it was everywhere and anywhere to be seen in the news. And so Deloitte people, and predominantly millennials, started coming to us asking questions. So what do we as a global network really doing to make an impact? And we do, and we have had programs at local and national level, but we did not feel that they really offered a scalable solution. And those solutions, while they contributed to specific needs, they didn't really bring out all of the capabilities that we have to offer to bear. And they didn't really meet all of those passions of all those professionals around the world wanting to make a difference. So we really embarked on that journey to identify a program that would address some of these issues. So the initiative that we're now launching is all about the economic potential of refugees, which is what we're talking about today. And it really speaks to what the Secretary General was talking about yesterday, that refugees and migrants are not a burden, that they offer wonderful potential only if we help to unlock it. So this is what this program sets to achieve. It sets to shift that paradigm that currently doesn't necessarily demonstrate how refugees really bring their talents, bring their skills, bring their aspirations that can really positively impact what, Alex, you said at the very beginning, the labor markets, the economies, and the societies in the host countries. So we're teaming up with the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University, and Alex here, and a global technology company, SAP, to do this program. So what the program is through a technology solution and collaborating with stakeholders in different sectors, we want to help connect refugees with education, employment, and entrepreneurship opportunities that are available to them. And we'll initially pilot this initiative in 3 countries in Europe with a view to scale in the future. And so we recognize also that Deloitte is not the only company trying to do this, and not the only organization trying to do this. There are many businesses that are also committed to the refugee issue. We see that in the Partners of the Tent Alliance, or the Partnership of Refugees that launched today. And that's the reason why we're taking an ecosystem approach to this. And we're looking to engage with various stakeholders and connect refugees to them. So for example, with other companies, they can be part of this initiative, part of this platform, as both offering refugees with opportunities such as employment, training, any kind of internship opportunities, but also use the platform to learn what are those real skills and talents in their market that are available to their companies. Also, the civil society that can act almost like a bridge between refugees and the services that are available to them. For example, when there's any language support required, or also just so where, for example, a refugee is for some reason not able to connect to a job, maybe there's some service that's needed to bridge that gap. So how can we engage the NGOs to do that? And similarly with local governments, with academia, with entrepreneurship networks. And at the heart of this ecosystem is an online platform that is really connecting all those different ecosystem players through the next generation data analysis and user experience-led design. And refugees themselves are also involved in creating and designing this initiative. So as part of the core team at Deloitte, we have a Syrian refugee, Marwa, who fled Syria in 2004. And she now lives in the Netherlands together with her husband and 2 young children. And not only does she help us engage with the refugee community to make sure that what we're creating and designing is relevant and meaningful to those communities, but also she's a wonderful example to us and even in our own organization to show what's possible when you only provide those opportunities to refugees. So there are so many opportunities within businesses and in those creative, innovative, collaborative solutions that help to unlock this potential of refugees. And while we're still in the very beginning of our journey and we're learning in this process, I'm very excited to see how this program evolves. And also in conversations like this today, I hope that it sparks more action and more of those collaboration opportunities between all of us around the room today.
So in a way, from what you described, this is emerging in a space where you're recognizing that other organizations and other actors are also doing skills matching, but the hope is for it to be ecosystemic, to engage others, to collaborate. What are the challenges of achieving that sort of wider collaboration and moving from a potentially an early pilot to something that can be inclusive of other organizations that want to do this?
Yeah, so I think it's really almost cutting through that noise and seeing what is out there. So there may be things that we're aware of, there may be some that are not, and we need to manage really the scope and to really make an impact. We need to be focused in how we start engaging, how we're really elevating the work that we're doing, and it's critical that we use those alliances like the Tent Alliance, which we're part of, and engage with those companies there, or anything like this, or use these types of conversations to engage with the actors that are involved in this space.
Fantastic. Will, to move in a slightly different direction, matching isn't just about matching refugees with businesses. It can also be about matching refugees with states. Tell us about Refugees Say and the Refugee Match. What is it and how has it arisen as an idea?
Sure. Thank you, Alex. So currently, just over 1 million refugees have been identified as being in desperate need of resettlement. That number is anticipated to go up to 1.17 million by next year. Despite that, in the status quo, roughly only 1 in 10 of those people can expect to be resettled. So resettlement is an incredibly scarce resource. Despite that, UNHCR has reported that since 2009, the total number of annual resettlement places have not been fully utilized. Now, what they mean is that there is resettlement capacity in the system that is literally going unfilled. There's a broader sense in which it's not being fully utilized, which is that that you could think that refugees and the communities that host them or welcome them are being mismatched. So an incredibly complex cocktail of different capacities goes into providing refugees with the sorts of things they need to flourish. Their family needs, their healthcare needs, education, skills, job opportunities, their psychosocial and spiritual needs, etc., etc. And crucially, those kinds of resources that refugees need in order to flourish are not evenly distributed across the communities that welcome them. So if we could get refugees to the right matches, to the right communities, there would be enormous gains. And so we know from the research on this that initial allocations of refugees to particular locations in resettlement really matters. It has extraordinarily dramatic effects on their likelihood of entering into employment rapidly, on their subsequent wages, on their health levels, and even generational effects on the educational attainment of their children. So we want to get this right. And resettlement agencies do try very hard to get this right, but they're often confronted with an impossibly complicated mass of information, which is hard to process properly, especially if you want to do it with large cohorts at speed. So what Alexandra and I are proposing is a system which systematically takes into account the capacities and priorities of hosting communities on the one hand, but also the needs and aspirations of refugees on the other. And the way to do this, as George Soros so kindly and wisely pointed out this morning, is through something called matching systems. Now, these are systems which deploy algorithms which can comprehensively and systematically process all of that complex information, and crucially, also include the preferences of refugees themselves as to the places or the kinds of areas that they would most wish to pursue their subsequent lives in. They can take that information and rapidly, using publicly available tested systems, deliver an outcome. And this is the same sort of technology which is used to allow parents in New York to express some choice over which school they wish to send their children to. It's the same system which in the United States matches live organ donors to kidneys and creates roughly 300 extra organ donations in America every single year. And so this system delivers an optimal outcome and restores dignity to refugees themselves by putting their preferences and their aspirations as to how they wish to live their lives in the driving seat. So what these systems can do is they can maximize the likelihood that refugees will be matched to the areas where they are most likely to be able to flourish in communities that are best placed, given their particular capacities, to be able to welcome them. So what Alex and I have done is we've set up an organization. It's called Refugees Say. Anyone can find out about it by going to www.refugees-say.com to explain, promote, and develop matching systems for refugee resettlement. The mathematics is done. This requires some tech development. It requires some database integration, some imaginative solutions to how we would think about doing interviews. But it holds the promise of saving huge amounts of time and money for resettlement agencies and enabling them to make the complex business of matching more accurate and easier and more empowering for the refugees that participate in it. Alex and I are already consulting for the British Home Office, but we're really eager while we're here to meet all and anyone who is interested in finding ways to give refugees more of a say. Thanks.
You mentioned that the maths is done, and I know there are pilots underway at the local level. Perhaps you could say a little bit about what those pilots are, but I also wonder, what are the challenges of taking this to the international level to align it with the politics of resettlement?
So, am I still on? Yeah. So, to answer the second question first, in principle, matching refugees to particular areas within a country and matching refugees internationally is the same system in its kind of structural core. If you want any set of countries, if they were willing to hypothetically share resettlement in some sort of burden-sharing scheme, could and should use a matching system. There are sort of enormous gains that come for free in making sure that particular countries, which are likely to have particular needs, but also things they're going to be particularly good at providing, should be matched to the refugees who most need those things. So if the European Union wished to have a hypothetical burden-sharing resettlement scheme, or indeed any smaller subset of countries that trusted each other enough to be willing to share just a resettlement clearinghouse, the gains would potentially be enormous. The key barriers are, I guess, political. States are jealous of their sovereignty. States often feel reluctant to concede power to a clearinghouse. So I think that the issue would be to persuade states that actually this doesn't involve sacrificing sovereignty. This empowers them. This gives them an opportunity to be matched with refugees that they are best able to welcome, that they are best able to provide for. In terms of piloting, we're very, very keen to persuade the British government that they should use a matching system in resettling refugees. This has not been done yet, though. Anyone who wished to implement a refugee match would be a world leader. It would be the first in the world. But matching has been used for decades now in a variety of other contexts with extraordinarily positive results.
Fantastic. Laura, we've focused very much on refugees so far in this discussion. But there's a broader population that we also need to focus on, migrants. And IOM has decades of experience of thinking about indirectly and directly matching migrants to labour markets. Could you share with us some of your experiences as an organisation on how this has worked in the past and how it could inform the current discussion?
Sure. Well, let me start by saying that we cannot only focus on refugees, because the large number of people that are moving are migrants. Refugees are only a small part of it. Well, the IOM has been working in assisting governments, because basically, as we are an international organization, intergovernmental organization, our role is to assist governments in creating the capacity in order to manage these things. So the first thing that we're trying to do for the last years has been to try to assist governments in developing what we call comprehensive labor migration programs, which imply basically the creation of a system where potential migrants can apply to the government, and then they can find solutions to go outside the country in a regular manner, so with all the papers, with everything, and with very often a certain level of preparation before they leave. So that could involve, depending on the government, that could involve skills training, vocational or technical. That could involve languages. That could involve as well cultural orientation of where they are going, what are the habits of those countries, what do you need to know in order to get there and get better or quicker integrated into the new place. So that is one big area of the work of IOM that we are doing in a lot of countries, particularly in South Asia, where a lot of governments have big labor migration programs that very often we're talking about 7 million people per year. The other exercise that we do is also looking at legislative frameworks within the government and see how these frameworks respond to those labor-oriented needs. And I have to say that in the majority of the times, they don't. So that is one of the problems, and then we made suggestions about how to move forward into this direction. And even in the cases where they have a legislative system that facilitates labor mobility, very often the implementation and enforcement of the systems is not perfectly working. So that's the second area. We have developed lately a group of like-minded public sector, the international organizations or employers and others that we have been looking at fair recruitment and ethical recruitment and how we can bring recruitment agencies, because we have seen, first of all, that a lot of the abuses and exploitation that happen on migrant workers are through unethical recruitment agencies. So we have been working on that, and this is an initiative that has been growing and now is taking place. It's called the International Recruitment Integrity System, and the objective is that it's a certification system, voluntary, where companies that are doing recruitment adhere by participating in it, adhere to some basic standards, including, and most important, the non-fees for jobs. Because the reality of today is that a large number of people pay in order to get a job. And very often that brings a mismatch between skills and jobs, because the jobs are given to the ones that can pay, not to the ones that have the skills. So that is another area that we have been working very much with the private sector. And the other area that we are working very much today in the last particularly 3 years has been in engaging in advocacy with private sector. Because the reality is what we are seeing here and what you have been talking about are relatively new things that are happening. The majority of the private sector, particularly with migrants, refugees have a different connotation because they are more, people are more willing to accept refugees than migrants. With migrants, private sector is always a little bit afraid that they are going to be seen as the one promoting the entrance of others that the population at large doesn't want. So advocacy with private sector in this regard is extremely important for us. So we have moved into that lately, not without a lot of problems, because I really like the descriptions of your mathematics, but it doesn't fit with my descriptions of the politics. And very often, you know, I'm sure that you're absolutely right, but I can tell you that I cannot tell that to not even one government. So.
That comment's quite sobering, because I think your intervention reminds us that market opportunities take place against the backdrop of government regulation, and that the incentives have to be right in order for markets to play a role in the lives of refugees and migrants. We've heard, I think, particularly from both Bruce and Will, that in introducing private-based initiatives, they need governments to do certain things. Is there a potential synergy, therefore, where an organization like IOM can play a role in advocating for the political space that's needed for market-based opportunities for skills matching?
Absolutely, and that's what we are doing. Basically, the first problem that we have is that the majority of the labor laws are developed with a logic of the national labor force. They are not developed with an international labor force at sight. So, and basically the logic is to protect the national labor force and to protect against the others that are coming from outside. So that is the first element that we have to overcome if we want to really develop labor market-oriented legislative frameworks. We have the second part that we have that governments face is the lack of data. They don't really know what skills are missing because it's not the government that needs the skills, it's the private sector that needs the skills. So as a result of that, it is extremely difficult for governments to come to you and to tell you these are the skills that we are needing. And there is this discussion between the government and the private sector is now taking place more and more, but it's not taking place in a systematic, organized manner. So the lack of data is seriously a problem in order for governments to move that. There is another element that is a more administrative, but is extremely important, that is the recognition and the accreditation of skills. There are no accreditation systems and recognition systems of skills that worldwide. You have some in order to recognize diplomas, university diplomas and things like that, but never skills. So people that come with different skills, they are in a vacuum of recognition, and as a result of that, very often it cannot work. The other element that I think is extremely important is creating system of protection. Governments are always afraid when they are developing labor migration programs that their people are going to be used or abused by the companies or where they are going. So we need, and they feel that they don't have necessarily the capacity to protect their people. But at the end of the day, I would say the biggest problem, and this is a little bit less for refugees, despite the fact that today refugees, unfortunately, are getting a negative connotation as well in a lot of countries, whereas in the past the refugees were extremely welcome everywhere. Today that is not the case anymore, is the negative perception that migrants and migration has. And because of this negative perception, the xenophobia that we see everywhere happening, and the discrimination that is happening, then it is extremely difficult for politicians to take measures that are pro migration or facilitating human mobility, because that is seen as totally unpopular. And you know that politicians don't want to do unpopular things. And some of them have paid very expensively lately some of the very positive approaches to migration that they have had. So if we don't change that perception in general, I think it is a problem. To conclude, just to say that the majority of migration laws contradict what we are talking here, contradict that human mobility. The majority of the migration laws are restrictive and make it extremely difficult to talk about skill matching and labor mobility. Thank you.
we can now open up to questions from around the table. If you want to raise your placard vertically, then the floor is yours. I've been reminded that to my left we have Ruba, Ibrahim, and Salim, who are themselves refugees and representatives of refugee organizations. And we should be reminded that many of these projects are concerned to give refugees a voice and a preference. And so if any of you would like to speak and say something about how you think markets, international organizations, governments can take refugees' preferences more seriously, then please do step in. Who would like the floor? Absolutely, Bruce.
One of our outreach volunteers who's working for us in Jordan is a Syrian lawyer named Suleiman. And this is what he told us about moving on a labor visa. He said, "I am a refugee like everyone around me. But if you go on a work visa, it says you're a doctor, you're a teacher, you have value, your skills are needed." That's what we're trying to do. Those are the people we're listening to.
What great pleasure it would have been to have these voices that we've heard just now, but also this morning at yesterday's UN summit, where there were 193 governments present, and now there are a handful here, and probably those are the governments that are already convinced about the importance of working together with the private sector and looking for the mechanisms that we can support and also the barriers that we have as governments to get rid of so that these initiatives can flourish and really sort of address the challenges that we are all facing here. In particular, because governments have already signed up to many things like skills recognition in many different forms, and certainly it was done so in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda last year as part of the overarching 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, where skills recognition is recognized as one of the things that we have to do together to facilitate human mobility around the world, to reduce the costs of migration. And I'm very glad that Ambassador Thompson mentioned IRIS, the work that Switzerland is supporting, because we are convinced of the added value together with other initiatives on fair and ethical recruitment. But also just to give you a sense of how difficult it still is to bridge this dialogue between private sector, and I would also like to add civil society, but also trade unions and the government. It took us quite a lot of convincing in the negotiations, and I'm not quite sure if I'm allowed to say that, but it's probably not a secret, in the negotiations of the political declaration that was adopted yesterday, to bring in one small sentence mentioning the importance of multi-stakeholder alliances to fulfill and implement the commitments that governments have taken yesterday. And I think for us it was absolutely essential to bring in this notion of multi-stakeholder alliances, and that's why we're also so extremely grateful to all the organizers here to have brought us together, because I think this is a first step after yesterday's summit to really look at these alliances. And just to conclude, I think the dialogue obviously has to continue. And here I would like also to mention the platform that Switzerland has been supportive together with other governments and has now handed over into the good hands of the IOE, the International Organization of Employers, and the World Economic Forum, the Global Agenda Council of Migration, which is the GFMD business mechanism. The Global Forum on Migration Development now has a business mechanism. It has been launched. It had a very successful first meeting in New York a couple of weeks back. I know that Mr. Fragomem here has been actively involved in this initiative, and I think that is just one example of the platforms that we need also in the future at different levels to continue this dialogue, because we as governments, we have to hear the voices that come from the private sector to say, well, we are ready to engage, but you governments have to come closer to us and have to understand what we need so that we can really fulfill what we want to do together. Thank you very much.
Ruba, you raised your card.
Just a quick introduction. My name is Ruba. I'm half Syrian, half Lebanese. I founded my own organization working with Syrian refugees. I've been involved in lobbying and advocacy since 2011. Just a couple of points. First of all, I'd like to say that we are partners with Talents Without Borders in Lebanon. We're very happy to see this partnership go through and do hopefully more fruitful work. On the matching issue, just an argument that you can perhaps use with the establishment is that they have been doing quite a lot of cherry picking when it comes to resettlement. I have been involved with government, UNHCR, and other discussions, and countries know very well how to pick based on different sexual orientations, religious orientations, or specific talents that they need in their countries. So why not give the same opportunity for refugees to do the same? From our side, I think the 3 points that I'd like to mention is I'm very happy to see a lot of mentioning of Syrian voices, and from Deloitte and other people who have spoken, and also from Bruce. But I'd like to say that I hope we don't fall in the pitfall of including Syrian voices as stories, or as just a token box of ticking the box that there's one Syrian there. There's a lot of Syrians who are actually experts in what they do. I myself have a PhD in economic development. My 2 colleagues are also have diverse, specific, skills. So I hope not to just include Syrians broadly, but to include them as experts, to consult with them as experts, and in that regard. The second thing that I'd like to say is to one of our key messages as part of this delegation was to push forward a more holistic approach. We need to target every single member of the family. Youth have been left into desperation. There's a lot of program, for example, on women empowerment, but men have been left unsupported. How do you expect a child to go to school if his parents are, if the mom's experiencing gender-based violence, if the father doesn't have a job? So we need to really target development from a holistic perspective, and for that the grassroots organizations can provide success stories of things that they have been trying to do for the past 5 years. And my final point is one of our core messages in this trip is that all of this work will be totally irrelevant if there is no stop and end to the violence. The first thing that we should all be advocating for is protection of civilians. And we have very powerful people in this room and in this summit more broadly, and we need to keep on pushing for the protection of civilians so that 10 years down the line we don't sit in the same room discussing the same issues about Syrian refugees. But perhaps more relevant to this particular points that we were raising is to pressure governments, especially the governments of Jordan and Lebanon, on the working permit and the legalization of residencies issues. We have been involved in the London summit, and there have been promises of work permits for Syrian refugees, but these promises haven't yet been unfolded. The refugees are totally sitting idle and unable to move even outside the camps because of fear, because they don't have regularized stay. So the business sector can put a lot of pressure on governments to regularize the stay of refugees, especially in Lebanon, but also to allow them to work and have a dignified life. Thank you.
We'll take 2 more brief comments from the floor, and then I'll come back very briefly to the speakers. Sasha.
Thanks very much. Sasha Chanoff with Refuge Point. I wanted to expand, Alex, on this idea of collective impact. There's a great article in the Harvard Business Review about systems entrepreneurship. This is the idea that no one organization is actually going to address the magnitude of problems we're facing, and that we have to figure out how to collectively work together. However, competition often limits our collective action because every organization is out for their own interests in a way. And so I wanted to just ask or see if anybody could comment on how people are recognizing what one another are doing and coming together to act more collectively in the interests of connecting refugees with employment opportunities.
And I believe there's a question. Is there a question just from the floor? Yeah.
Hello? Okay, here we go. Apologies for the delay. So it's a comment and a concern that's related to the one that Dr. Thompson raised. In hearing all of these initiatives, I think they're amazing. There's so much innovation in here. But if you look at a very granular level at the areas where refugees and migrants are most vulnerable to xenophobic exclusion and to other ways of trying to keep them out of communities, socioeconomic anxieties are at the forefront. They're taking our jobs is a narrative that really dominates. And so connecting to something that was said in an earlier panel where the Canadian example empowers private citizens to then become a voice that pushes back against a kind of higher level xenophobic narrative, I wondered whether that might be something you could speak to. And what I mean more precisely is, do your initiatives, the various people who have spoken, include local community members who are citizens of those countries in trying to buy in to refugees and migrants as groups that are going to be beneficial to the communities? And how are they built into the model? Because if not, all of these innovations risk exacerbating precisely the kinds of dynamics that I worry are resulting in the lack of inclusion of refugees and actually making them more vulnerable to further exclusion. So I'm curious to hear more about that.
Back and give 30 seconds to each of our panelists. Bruce.
Yeah. On the last question, we've thought about that. And what we're trying to do is really thread a needle. And if there is talent, local talent on the ground, that's who the employers ought to be hiring. If there is a skill gap, if there's a lack of that talent on the ground, those are the hard-to-fill jobs we're trying to fill and asking employers to open their eyes to refugee talent to fill that skill gap. We want this to be a win-win situation. We will also involve, to the extent there are Syrian or Middle Eastern diaspora members or professional societies on the ground, try to involve them in being helpful in getting people settled. So yes, you are absolutely right. There are risks, but we're trying to overcome them.
Justina.
Sure. I'd like to make a comment on two of the points raised, one about this narrative and the other one about the collective impact. So I love the systems entrepreneur notion, and I want to read that article. But I think really that's exactly what we're trying to do with the initiative that we're launching. We don't want to compete with other initiatives or programs that are taking place, or maybe other matching solutions, where we're looking to do, okay, if there is a solution already in one market, how can we plug it in and make it work and make it part of this systemic solution? So that's why I said this ecosystem approach into solving the issues and bringing the stakeholders around it. And I invite you to come and speak to me if you already have ideas about doing that. And the second point I wanted to build on is the narrative. So as part of what we're trying to do is through the insights and data gathered and also through the research that we want to do around the economic lives of refugees, we want to make it available such that there's true fact-based information available about refugees, their talents and their aspirations that you can point to when you have dialogue with anyone, whoever it might be. It might be policymakers, it may be NGOs programming work.
Will?
Thank you. I'd like to start, if I may, with the excellent question that came from the floor about xenophobic or restrictionist narratives. I suppose at the simplest level, I would hope that refugee matching would help with that to the extent that it would make refugees more likely to flourish after resettlement. But more precisely, I suppose, more specifically, one aspect of refugee matching, which I think is important, is that it's a two-sided process, which also elicits information from local communities at the local level about their priorities, their capacities, and so on. So, and I think that has two important effects. So firstly, I think from my experience in Britain, the willingness of local communities to host refugees is undermined when they feel like that willingness is taken for granted and they are assigned cases that they realistically lack the capacity to deal with. That the whole thing blows up in their face and they think, well, we'll never do that again. Refugee matching can minimize that. It can guarantee that that won't happen if the capacities to avoid that do exist. The second thing I think undermines the willingness of communities to welcome refugees is when they feel that it is imposed in a top-down way upon them. refugee matching also empowers the communities to be like, this is what we think we're good at, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do. And so to the extent that they're empowered and involved, I would also hope that that might make communities more willing in the long term to welcome more refugees. One final thought, if I may, which is that, just to say, we have found no problem persuading governments that they want to implement refugee matching domestically. International matching is hard. At the domestic level, everyone agrees that we want to use our limited capacity as effectively as possible. What is hard is convincing governments to increase resettlement places. What refugee matching is about using capacity that is already offered to people that have already been flagged for resettlement as well as we possibly can.
Laura.
Just to say that these are not mathematical exercises. We're talking about people. And when we are talking about people, we're talking about hopes, we're talking about real conditions of people. And, you know, the most in need are normally not the most skilled. So we have to remember these things. It's part of a solution that is much broader. It's a very good part of a solution, and I'm not certainly putting a negative aspect of it, but it's only just part of it. And dealing with migrants and with refugees in a way that make their life easier, that we protect them, that we allow them to integrate into their societies, and at the same time that we allow the society to integrate with the new ones that are arriving and the communities to accept them well and to not feel discriminated against the ones that are being helped is a very complex political exercise. And I think that we have to remember that when we are talking about these things. I love to have private sector much more involved in these things because we cannot do it without the private sector. And I think that this is a very substantial move forward, that to see private sector really engaged in seeing how they can help. It's also good for business, for the private sector, so I appreciate that too. But we have to remember that we are talking about people here and not about numbers.
So I think we have from this fabulous panel at least two implications for the call to action. Firstly, we need coordination mechanisms through matching in order to ensure that refugees and migrants get market-based opportunities, including employment. But secondly, to achieve that, we need collective impact. No actors can work in isolation. We need businesses to come together and to work across the ecosystem, but we also have to have governments who are prepared to remove the barriers to allow markets to flourish, and we have to have international organizations and others prepared to lobby and advocate for that. So please could I invite everyone to join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions.